Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we aim to get you truly informed fast.
And today we're really diving into the incredible speed of change in geopolitics.
Yeah, it feels like the ground is constantly shifting, doesn't it? Economic, political power centers, they're all kind of redefining how they relate to each other.
It's a lot to keep track of.
Definitely. Now, before we get into the thick of today's topic, we wanted to spotlight something for you history buffs out there.
Oh, yeah.
It's Hui Wang's A History of China series. You can find it on Amazon. It's this really deeply researched collection, takes you all the way through China's past.
I've heard good things about that one.
The latest volume just came out, covers the Southern Song dynasty. So whether you like ebooks or, actual paperbacks, it's genuinely a must-read if you're interested in global history or just understanding the background to today's headlines.
Good recommendation. Adds important context.
Exactly. So our mission today, we're unpacking two very recent and I think very connected events.
Okay, what have we got?
The EU-China summit that happened back on July 24th, and then the U.S.-EU trade agreement framework that was announced right after that.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Very closely timed.
Right. So we want to pull out the key takeaways, help you understand not just what happened, but crucially why it matters for, well, the future of global power.
Okay, let's start with that EU-China summit. It's interesting because, it wasn't just any summit. It was the 25th one, and it actually marked 50 years of diplomatic ties.
50 years. Wow. Back to the European Economic Community days, right? 1975.
Exactly. And China, well, they really played up that anniversary. They talked a lot about the EU being a comprehensive strategic partner.
Meaning,
they see the EU as key in promoting this idea of global multipolarity, a world with several power centers, not just one or two, supporting globalization, diversity, that kind of thing.
And the EU sent top people, didn't they? Both the Council President and the Commission President.
They did. The Council President, more political focus, and the Commission President, who really holds the economic reins. Sending both definitely highlighted the summit's importance, at least symbolically.
Symbolism matters, but what actually happened, I heard the agenda was trimmed.
That's putting it mildly. It was surprisingly narrowed, as you say.
Yeah.
The whole thing lasted just one day. Usually it's two. And maybe more telling, key side events got canceled, things like a planned economic dialogue, and even a visit by the Commission President to some Chinese companies in Hefei. That just didn't happen.
Okay, so less glad-handing, maybe more focus on sticking points. That sounds like a tighter, more principle-focused agenda, less room for detailed industry stuff.
Precisely. It signaled a shift. But look, it wasn't all disagreement. They did manage to find some common ground.
Like what?
Climate change.
Yep, climate change was one. They put out a joint statement on that. It's still a shared priority, clearly.
And China also agreed to speed up approvals for rare earth exports, the ones not tied to military use. That's actually a pretty big deal for industries in places like Germany.
Rare earths, always crucial. But let's get to the friction points, because there were quite a few, right? What were the EU's main complaints?
Oh, definitely. The big one was the trade deficit. The EU is looking at something like a 300 billion deficit with China. That's huge.
300 billion euros.
Oof. Yeah. And they didn't just point to the number. They accused China of subsidizing key exports, think electric vehicles, solar panels, which they say leads to dumping.
Selling below cost, basically, to grab market share.
Exactly. Distorting competition. Plus, the EU also kept pressing China about its ongoing trade with Russia. That's obviously a major sticking point given the geopolitical situation.
And China's response, did they just push back?
They had their own list of complaints, for sure. They criticized EU restrictions on high-tech exports, things like advanced lithography equipment for chips.
The semiconductor bottleneck again?
Right. And they also pointed to EU trade barriers, tariffs, rules about government procurement that shut out Chinese companies.
So lots of talking, but any actual agreements on these tricky issues?
Not really. No concrete resolutions came out of it. Both sides basically said, we need to keep talking. China used the phrase dynamic balance for trade.
Dynamic balance sounds flexible, maybe a bit vague. Does that really solve that massive trade deficit issue for the EU?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? It leads right into this core EU challenge.
Yeah.
Their own strategy towards China. Remember that 2019 strategic outlook?
The one where they call China three things at once?
Exactly. A partner on things like climate, a competitor economically and technologically, and a rival in terms of political systems.
Partner, competitor, rival, all at the same time.
It's inherently contradictory, right?
Yeah.
How do you create consistent policy like that? It's like, imagine a traffic light stuck on red, yellow, and green simultaneously.
Right. Do you stop? Do you go? Do you just edge forward cautiously? That must be incredibly confusing for businesses and policymakers in the EU.
It absolutely is. And that complexity, that internal tension, it didn't just stay within the EU-China context. It seemed to spill over almost immediately.
How so?
Well, very soon after that summit in China, the EU Commission president flew to the UK and met with the former U.S. president.
Interesting timing.
And then, just 3 days after the EU-China summit wrapped up on July 27th, boom, the U.S. and the EU announced this new trade agreement framework.
Okay, that is fast. Now, something in that framework caught my eye. Unlike that U.S.-Vietnam deal people talked about, this U.S.-EU one didn't have a clause specifically targeting Chinese goods that might be re-exported through Europe.
Ah, you picked up on that. Yeah, that omission is pretty significant.
What do you think it signals?
Well, it strongly suggests that both the U.S. and the EU wanted to avoid adding, another layer of complication to their trade relationships with China right now. Maybe a pragmatic choice. Like, let's deal with our own issues first.
Makes sense. Okay, so what are the terms of this U.S.-EU deal then?
It's a big shift. Basically, U.S. goods going into Europe. 0 tariffs.
0, okay. And EU goods going the other way.
That's where the pain point is for Europe. Most EU exports heading to the U.S. will now face a 15% tariff.
15%. Up from what, like 2% on average?
Yeah, around that. So it's a significant jump, a major change.
Ouch. Are there exceptions?
There are. Some key items are still tariff-free. Things like aircraft and aircraft parts, crucial semiconductor equipment, those lithography machines again, and some specific chemicals.
So strategically important stuff gets a pass. What did the EU get in return for accepting these higher tariffs generally?
Well, there are 2 big commitments on the EU side. First, they agreed to buy $750 billion worth of U.S. energy over 3 years, mostly natural gas.
$750 billion? That's a lot of energy. LNG, presumably.
Mostly, yes. And second, they pledged $600 billion in U.S. investments, though the details on that investment part are still pretty fuzzy.
$600 billion in investment. Vague details. Okay, but why did Europe agree to the 15% tariff hit? It seems like a big concession.
It does on the surface, but you have to look at the context. First, that 15% was actually a compromise. The initial U.S. proposals were apparently talking about rates starting at 30%.
30%. Okay, 15% looks better in that light.
Right. And the deal also cleverly left out some really contentious issues.
Right.
Like the whole digital services tax fight. That's been kicked down the road.
Avoiding other battles.
And maybe most importantly, this deal structure didn't force Europe into making a definitive choice, siding completely with the U.S. against China. Given the war in Ukraine and everything else, maintaining some strategic flexibility was seen as absolutely vital.
So it's like damage control. They took a hit with the 15% tariffs, but avoided a potentially worse outcome like 30% and kept their options open geopolitically. A stop-loss outcome, maybe?
That's a good way to put it. An acceptable stop-loss. They didn't get pushed into fully alienating either the U.S. or China, which seems critical right now.
But you mentioned fuzzy details on investment. Is this deal actually finalized, or are there still moving parts?
Oh, absolutely not final. That's crucial. This is a framework. There are still big negotiations happening.
Like on what?
Special tariffs. Things like steel, aluminum, even semiconductors themselves, those might still face tariffs higher than 15%. There's talk of maybe 50% on steel and aluminum. That's still on the table.
50%. Wow. Okay, so major uncertainty remains there.
And that $600 billion investment pledge, still very unclear how that works. I mean, governments can't just order private companies to invest somewhere. How they'll actually encourage or structure that, well, nobody seems to know yet.
Right, that sounds like a major implementation hurdle.
Yeah.
Okay, let's zoom out. We've looked at the EU-China summit, the US-EU deal. What does this tell us about the broader U.S.-EU-China triangle? You mentioned it's not linear.
Exactly. I think there were maybe 3 key characteristics to grasp here. First, yes, EU-China cooperation is possible, but those internal EU divisions are really deep and they limit things.
We saw cooperation on climate. You mentioned maybe AI, digital economy as other possibilities.
Potentially, yeah. China's interested in multi-centralized AI governance, which kind of aligns with Europe's push for strict internet rules. Europe actually has a lot of AI models, even if they lag the U.S. and China in, usage and funding. So there's common ground there.
But the divisions you mentioned.
They're huge. Remember, the EU is 27 countries. They don't all see eye to eye on investment, trade, or geopolitics. It's not a monolith.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Take investment. Germany, right, the EU's economic engine, responsible for like 40% of EU exports to China. They have really strict demands if foreign companies want to invest there, protects local jobs, get technology transfer, defend market share. That makes Chinese companies quite hesitant sometimes.
Okay, cautious approach from Germany.
But then you look at a country like Hungary, less wealthy, different priorities. They're actively seeking Chinese investment, welcoming things like EV factories to boost local jobs. For them, it's about straightforward economic growth, maybe less about the other strategic concerns.
So completely different approaches within the same union. Germany being protective, Hungary rolling out the red carpet.
Exactly. And you see it geopolitically, too. Think about defense spending, especially if Trump were to return and push NATO allies harder. Spain is resisting increases. France wants more EU defense autonomy but struggles with debt. Germany seems willing to spend more but reluctant to lead.
And the Baltic states?
They fundamentally trust the U.S. and NATO much more than some sort of independent EU defense. They want U.S. troops on their soil. So getting all 27 to agree on a single strong foreign policy or investment strategy, it's incredibly slow and difficult because it relies on consensus.
That internal dynamic is key for you, the listener, to grasp. The EU acts collectively, but getting it to move quickly or change direction is like turning a giant ship.
A very large ship with 27 different captains arguing over the course.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the first characteristic. Possible cooperation, but deep internal divisions. What's the second?
The second is just how deeply the EU remains tied to the U.S. economy. You simply cannot overstate this. It's an irreplaceable market for Europe.
We're talking huge numbers.
Massive. Annual trade across the Atlantic goods and services is over $1.68 trillion. That's nearly 30% of all global trade. It counts for something like 43% of global GDP combined. Staggering.
And the U.S. market itself is just bigger for consumers.
Significantly bigger. The U.S. consumer market is around, $18.8 trillion? Compare that to the EU's roughly $10 trillion, and China's around $7 trillion.
So for those key European exports, cars, pharma, aerospace parts, losing access to the U.S. market isn't something they can just make up by selling more to China.
Not even close. The scale is just different. So despite all the trade friction we see, despite the arguments, Europe's fundamental economic reliance on the U.S. means it's incredibly unlikely to risk that core relationship for some kind of full pivot towards China. The economic gravity is just too strong.
Okay, deep U.S. ties. What's the third characteristic? You said it's not linear.
Right. The third point is that these relationships don't evolve in straight lines. It's what political scientists call complex interdependence.
Complex interdependence. Break that down.
It basically means that global outcomes aren't just decided by governments anymore. You've got multinational companies, international organizations like the EU itself, all interacting, exchanging money, information, sharing power. No single country, not even the U.S. or China, can fully dictate the agenda on everything.
So a change in one area doesn't automatically cause a predictable change elsewhere. Like U.S.-EU trade friction doesn't automatically mean the EU cozies up to China.
Exactly. Because despite those trade fights, the U.S. and EU are still deeply aligned on other core priorities. Think NATO, think their coordinated support for Ukraine. Those links remain strong.
And the EU's own role in this complex web.
Well, the EU is definitely an influential global player, especially on things like climate rules and environmental standards. It's a leader there. But as we discussed, its consensus nature means it lacks the swift, decisive power of the U.S. or China. It's also heavily dependent on technology made elsewhere, including from China.
So influential, but not independently setting the global agenda in the same way.
Right. It can shape things, regulate things, but it doesn't quite have the same unilateral reach.
And how does China play this complex game? What's their strategy towards the EU in this context?
China seems to view the EU as part of the crucial global middle ground, regions that have significant production capacity and consumer strength. Engaging the EU, keeping ties stable, especially on climate or digital issues, helps China reduce global uncertainty. It supports their long-term goal of a more multipolar world, acting as a bit of a counterbalance.
So for China, it's strategic to keep the EU engaged, even if they're not full allies, to create a more balanced global system.
I think that's a fair way to see it. It reduces risks and promotes stability from their perspective.
Okay, so understanding this complex interdependence helps us see it's not a simple chessboard. It's more like a 3D web, maybe? Shifts in one strand cause ripples, but not always in predictable ways.
That's a good analogy. It's dynamic, multifaceted.
All right, so let's try to wrap this up. We've gone through the EU-China summit, the U.S.-EU trade framework. Quite a journey.
We have. We've seen the areas of cooperation, the really stark disagreements, and these deeper, sometimes contradictory forces shaping how the EU, US, and China interact. Hopefully you have a clear picture now.
Definitely. Okay, here's a final thought I want to leave you with, something to chew on. The EU has this explicit strategy of de-risking from China. We've talked about that.
Right, reducing dependencies.
But we've also talked about the EU's own deep internal divisions on things like investment and defense. So considering both those things, the de-risking push and the internal splits, what does that realistically mean for the scale and the ambition of any future EU-China cooperation? Even in areas like climate or AI, where they supposedly share interests. Can those shared global challenges really overcome the underlying economic competition and the political differences?
That's the multi-trillion euro question, isn't it? How much cooperation is truly possible when the foundations are that complex and, frankly, divided?
Something for you to ponder as you watch the news.
Indeed. And hey, if you want to dig deeper into the historical context, especially for China, don't forget that recommendation from the start.
Oh, right. Hui Wang's A History of China on Amazon. The new volume covers the Southern Song dynasty. Really helps understand the long view behind today's events.
Absolutely. Context is everything.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it was insightful.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.